Welcome back to Appify Your Business. This video is going to cover how you can establish a many-to-many relationship between two different tables. With AppSheet, there's no easy way to create this type of relationship like there is if you're creating a one-to-many relationship done by using a ref column type pointing back to the primary table essentially. And you can see there's a link to that video that I've done previously on this. This video is going to be a little bit more in depth than my usual videos because there is a lot of nuances in setting up your app to successfully display information with a many-to-many relationship. So for this example, we're going to have an app here that has a list of users that can be associated with many communities. So you can see Amber here has a lot of different communities that she's associated with. And we could also have a community table where there are multiple users that are associated with that community. And if we go and update each user, for example, and we add users to different communities, then the app will also update the other table as well. So for example, here I added architecture to John here. If we go to architecture, we'll see that John has been added here to the community as well, right? So this allows for bi-directional updates between the two different tables to make it easy to update from both ends. So in architecture here, I wanted to update the architecture table and add somebody else and remove Amber, for example. I can go ahead and click that. And then when I go back to, Amber, for example, I'll see architecture here once my app is done syncing. And then we'll see here that with Amber, that architecture is gone from her profile as well. And this method I'm showing you is overkill in a lot of situations. So I would take the bits and pieces of what would work for your app and apply those in your app. There's no need to actually take all of this if your app doesn't require it, especially that bi-directional updating if you don't need it. So just keep that in mind as we go through this example today. So let's get into it. So I have two tables that I want to create a many-to-many relationship with. Whereas I have a users table where users can select multiple communities, and I have a community table for which I want to be able to store multiple users that are associated with that community. So this is going to focus on the very basic way that you could set up a many-to-many relationship with only two tables. There are other methods that you can use to add in a third table to make things more useful, which would be definitely needed in situations that would require additional attributes that need to be recorded. But for this video, we're going to try to keep things as simple as possible so you can understand the building blocks and how to set this up, and then hopefully take this a little further and work this into other applications that have more complexity. So for this table, we have a users table and we have a community table. And for both of these different tables, we want to be able to capture the respective associations. So for the users table, we want to be able to capture the communities that each user is associated with, and they could have more than one community. And then likewise for the community, we want to be able to capture the multiple users that are associated with that community as well. So this is a many-to-many relationship because each relationship can have multiple values when defining that. The first step we need to do is actually define the column that is going to capture that relationship. So in the users table, we're going to have a column called communities, which will store each community that each user is associated with. And then in the community table, we will have the users field, which will store the different users that each community has. And this is initially how we're going to start, with just this field being added to each of our tables, right? So just think of it as the opposite. And then we'll go ahead and turn this into an app. All right, so once we're in the app editor, we're going to go ahead and add our second table here. And we'll see we'll add the community table as well. So we have both the users and the community table in our application. So first we need to define essentially our columns that we've added, right? And we know because we're going to require multiple values to be selected for the column, we need to make this column an enum list, but also still reference the other table accordingly. And this is where things start to get a little bit more complex than just creating a typical one-to-many relationship where you can just select reference as the base type and be done with. With these columns, because we're using enum list and we want that to be a reference column, we need to configure some additional options. So we're going to click edit here. And for column type, we're first going to choose enum list because we want to capture multiple values. And then we want to come down here to base type and choose reference as a base type. And just like with any other reference type, we're going to choose the table that this users field is referencing, which is going to be the users table. And then we'll hit done, and then we'll do the same for our users table where we have our communities, and we want our communities to be an enum list, and we want our reference type or base type to be reference, and we want to reference the community table for that. So we'll go ahead and hit save. So now when we're looking at our app, we'll make this a little bit bigger. We have a little bit more screen real estate. When I click on a user, I can see now my user's view here. When I click on a user and I hit the edit button, I now have this enum list for communities. And when I click on that, I'll notice there's a problem here. I don't actually see any of the communities that are selectable at the moment. And unfortunately, this is due to a bug that's currently in AppSheet that can be worked around essentially so typically when you're using a regular type of reference field, AppSheet's going to get a list of suggested values automatically just because you establish that as a reference. But with enum list and using the reference as a base type, you can't do that. So what we need to do is under auto compute, go down to suggested values here. And we need to use and basically call out the column where we want to pull the values. So this is a little manual step that needs to be done, in that we want to get a list of emails for that drop-down menu. And then we'll also go to the users table and the communities table and do the same thing here under auto compute with suggested values, and use the community field here in the list form to generate a list of values for that. And then we'll go ahead and hit save. And now in the application, if we look at Amber here, I can come down here to communities, and now I have the option to choose the different communities in the table or add a new one. So that's the first step here in setting up the ability to easily choose for multiple communities for a specific profile. Now let's go ahead and save this and see what happens here. So now we could say, after I've saved this, I now have my communities, architecture and engineering that were selected for Amber. However, one of the next problems that we'll see is if we go over to the community now and look at architecture, for example, as a community, I don't see the users selected as well, right? So we have a problem here where the users table is not updating the community table appropriately. So this is going to lead into the next step, that we need to basically evolve our application to make sure that when we update the communities for a user, that the community is also updated appropriately with the user information. So all this data is going to be existing in the table itself. Now, there's other ways you can basically design your app to use virtual columns that can show it virtually. But if your goal is to have a steady data source that actually records the information, this is going to be one of your better avenues to do this. So to do this, we're going to need to create two different columns per table. So one to keep track of any ads, and the other one to keep track of any removals, so that there's a comparison between the two different states before the change occurs and after the change occurs. We're ultimately going to use these values to create some automations to update those values between the two tables. So in the users table here, With communities, we're going to add um, a column called communities added and also a column called communities removed. And then also in the community side, we'll add users added and users removed. And back in AppSheet, we'll regenerate our columns. And then we're going to make sure, because these are essentially going to be lists, we'll make sure that these are also enum lists as well, so that AppSheet tracks these appropriately. All right, so now that we've added these two columns here, we first need to create some sort of action that's going to be updating the community record when new users are made. And then for these new columns, what we need to do is we need to calculate in each of these respective tables what entities were added and what entities were removed. So normally you can just use the formula to auto compute these values. However, we still need to have the flexibility to add values manually through an action if we need to. So instead of adding an app formula for these columns, what we need to do is under auto compute, we're going to use an initial value with reset on edit triggered. So this will basically force a very similar effect to app formula with the added benefit of being able to have actions right to those columns as well. We're going to turn this on, and then for the formula that we're going to use for communities added, we need to basically be able to go compare the before and after states here. So when communities are added, if we subtract the final state after the update and subtract it from the previous state, we will essentially have a list of entities that were added to the communities field here. So we can go communities minus this row before dot communities. And this will generate that list of adds to the table here. And I'm going to copy this just to have this. And then we're also going to come down to communities removed here, where we will also set an initial value where we start with the state before and then subtract out the communities list after. So that'll give us essentially all the items that were removed from the list here. And then we'll make sure update behavior is reset on edit. And then we're going to repeat this process with community as well. So we'll have for users added, we'll have our initial value set to where users minus this row before dot users is going to generate a list of users that were added. And then we'll make sure that this is reset on edit. And then for those removed, we will also have this row before dot users minus users. And then we'll also make sure that those are reset on edit. Then we'll hit save. And then we'll do a little demo really quick of these changes. So let's look at Amber here. Two communities right here, garden no code. And if we were to come here and then change those values, let's remove no code and add engineering, then we'll see that we have those reflection, these fields were updated accordingly. We're not going to have these columns showing in the final version of the app. I'm just showing you here how this formula is computing and how if we add new fields, these entities update accordingly. And this gives us a solid field to be able to reference for any data changes that we need to make when we're trying to update the opposing tables in our application. So with that in place, now we can go ahead and actually create the actions that are going to perform the edits to the other table. So remember in the user table here, when we update the communities to the profile, we also want the respective community or communities to then update with an add to the user list. So we're going to first start with the perspective of updating the user themselves. So we need some kind of action that's going to update the community. So we're going to go to actions here, and for the community table, we're going to add a new action, and we're going to then make an action called add users. This action is going to represent the action that AppSheet will make when the automation runs, and essentially add that user that chose to add the community to their profile. So for add users, we're going to simply take the user's added field here. And this is where the part of not using the app formula will come in handy, because we need to be able to update this field too when changes are being made. For users added, what we want to do is use the input formula, and we're basically just going to have a very simple input here that we can then trigger an input from the parent action, essentially. So for those of you not familiar with the input function in AppSheet, this basically allows you to either prompt the user to input an action. This is beneficial if you want an action button where somebody has to input a date, which can vary and is not predictable. You can use input to have the user click a button to input a date, and then have a pop-up window where they could input the date. Or you can actually tie an action like this to another action and transfer the values from one action to another. And that's what we're going to use in this case. We're basically going to get the email address from the user that added the community and transfer it to this action to then update this value as needed. And then next, we're going to add the users removed. And once again, we'll have input, and then we'll have remove user. So the end result being that we have two fields now that we're populating also, where we have in certain situations whether a user's been added or removed from a community. And then the last field we want to then update is ultimately the users list, that field here that's keeping track of the users in a certain community. So we can have a simple equation here where we just add in, we remove the users that are removed, and add in the users that are added to get a final list. And we'll update this, and we'll update this action here to something more general called update users. So just to refresh, we're keeping track of this action is receiving any inputs for users that are added to that community and users that are removed for that community, and then ultimately updating the user field, which holds the list of users that are associated with that community. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create the community one. So we're on the same format here. We'll call update communities, and then we'll add the columns here: communities added, communities removed, and communities. And then we'll use the input here called communities added, and an input called communities removed. Now, keep in mind, this value in the input function is totally arbitrary. It's going to be essentially a variable that's going to show up in other actions that reference this that you can choose. So you just need to make something that you'll know what it means and what input it's referencing. And then down to the communities here, we'll subtract out the communities that are removed and then add in the communities that are added. And hit save again to lock that in. And then finally, to tie this all together, we're going to create the bots that are actually going to be performing and triggering the actions that we want to make in our application. So our bot is going to be configured for all changes. And that's the first part here, for all changes. And then we're going to add a step here, and this is going to be a custom step where we run a data action, and we're going to run an action on a set of rows. So this is going to be from the users table, what we need to do is update the community table, right? Because that's what we want to do. When we make a change to the user profile, we're going to be updating the community. And then for referenced rows, what we need to do is we need to target the communities added. And we're going to do this one step at a time. So first, we're going to target the communities added in the list. So we're going to target our update users fields with the input of add user. And then we're for the add user, this is obviously going to be the email address, right, of the user that's being added. So that's it for this action. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just create another action that's going to be very similar to this, run a data action and run an action on a set of rows where our reference rows are going to be the ones that are removed. And then you can imagine for the actions here at the input, we want to target the ones that are removed, where we are removing the user. And then we're going to use the email address again. So we have two different actions that run. One is for the communities that are added, and the other one's for the communities that are removed. And then we could make sure these steps are named appropriately so we remember it. So we can say add users to community. Then we could give this step a name too, called add. Give this a name, remove users from community. And then we'll give this a name. We'll make sure we give this a properly descriptive name. Update community after user profile change. And then we're going to repeat the same process with the communities table here. So we'll create a new bot and we'll make all changes for the event. And then for the custom step, we'll run a data action where we run an action on a set of rows. And we'll make sure that we're starting in the right table, which is we want this bot to run anytime the community is updated. And then we'll run an action on a set of rows here where we're basically targeting an action in the users table. And for the referenced rows, we want to highlight the users that are added. And then we're going to choose that action called update communities. And then we're going to choose this input communities added. And then we're going to choose the community that was added. And then we'll also repeat and make a very similar type action where we target the users that are removed from the community. And then likewise, the referenced action, update communities, and then the inputs, communities removed with the community value set there. Just like before, we'll clean this up here and say communities added. And then we'll also have the communities removed as the step here. So, and then we'll give this a name too. This bot a name called update user after community. Then we'll hit save. So just to kind of reiterate what we've done holistically here. So now when we view the app, just to test things out, we'll notice that we have an action here that's showing up that we don't need to have in there. So we can go ahead and clean that up real quick. We'll just go to those actions here, and under appearance for those actions, we just want to have do not display, as this is just going to be used by the bot itself. And then we'll do the same for the update communities as well. So that'll remove them from our app so they're not cluttering our application. Now with these changes made, we can go ahead and test the functionality of the app to make sure it's going to function the way we want it to. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clear out all the community information and all the user information from these communities, just so we start fresh. So here for Amber, I'm going to then add her to a couple communities here. Let's add her to gardening and architecture. And we see these two fields down below that are picking up the changes. And remember, we'll remove these shortly, but we'll just keep them here for testing purposes. And when we hit save, we'll see that has been logged accordingly. And if we go over to the community now for gardening, we should expect to see Amber sitting there in the users, which she is. So let's try this again. Let's try with John now, where we're going to add John to the gardening community and maybe some other communities here, no code and nature. And then we'll hit save as well. So now if we go to gardening, we should see John and Amber. And with no code, we should just see John. So if we go to gardening, we see Amber and John. And if we back out here and go to no code, we just see John. So right now it looks like it's working fairly well. Let's test the use case here where if we remove Amber from a community here, let's remove her from gardening and then hit save. Let's make sure that she is removed from gardening. So we can see here after it syncs here that Amber is now removed from gardening and just John is part of the community. And if we try to mix and match adds and removals, let's just add Amber to everything where we are adding and then we're removing her from architecture. So we have some adds and removals going on. We hit save. Then we should expect that we should see Amber in all the communities except architecture. So we can see if we see her in gardening, which we do. We see her in engineering. But what about architecture? And we don't see her in architecture. So this means we have a successful bot going. And now let's test it in the opposite direction now with community. So now with engineering, let's say I want to remove Amber from engineering and hit save. Now, if I go to Amber's profile, I should see that she is no longer part of engineering after the app finishes syncing. And there you go. You can see that she is no longer part of engineering. And then for any of our other communities, we could test it as well. Let's just remove John and Amber. Let's add Sandra. So we're going to have some users added and users removed. And we hit save and we go to Sandra. You see Sandra is part of gardening, but John is removed from gardening and Amber is also removed from gardening. This all appears to be functioning properly. After that stage is done, let's focus in on the maybe elephant in the room here, in that my values here for the list of communities aren't very interactive. So when I view Amber, I would expect to have the ability here to essentially click on the values to go to the no code community or to go to the nature community. But I don't have that right now. I just have comma separated values, which aren't very useful from the user perspective. So now we're going to get into this third part essentially of setting up this many-to-many relationship where we're going to create an inline view for these records on both sides that will allow you to add a table view or a gallery view or a deck view and have that in line with the profile so that users can actually quickly get to the information they need, i.e., I want to look at what this nature community is all about, and I should be able to click on it without having to go over to the communities tab and click 2 times essentially to figure out where I want to go. The first thing we need to do and really to understand is that all inline views in AppSheet, all they are a list of IDs in their targeted table. In the basic functionality of a one-to-many relationship where you're creating a reference column to another table, this is that virtual column that AppSheet generates with the refrows formula. All that formula is generating that list of IDs that are essentially going to be that inline table for AppSheet to use. So we can also just manually construct that in this situation where we need to have an inline view that may not be editable, but just to be visually shown to the users. So to do that, we'll start with the users table here, and we're going to just add a virtual column. And we're going to call this column Communities Inline. And obviously, you can always change that later. I'm just using this for the purposes of illustrating this function here, where we have this separate column, which is going to be the inline view for these communities in the user table. So for the app formula itself, the app formula is just going to be communities, because this field is an enum list of IDs of each community anyway. So that's all we're doing here, is creating a list virtual column of that same column that already stores the different community values. So we're going to add that, and then I'm going to go to community and do the same thing with community, where we're going to add users inline and then add the users Enumlist column there to the application. And then I'm going to hit save. And then for each user now, when I click on a user, if I scroll down, I now have an inline view here. And you can see this nice gardening gallery view that I could then click on and then go to the gardening view. And then when I'm in a community, like the gardening view here with the community, I now have the ability to see the users that I can then click on as well. So you can see how these now create more of a fluid application that I can then easily access the context for particular users or particular communities and have the additional information associated with those entities right there in that record that you're viewing. So with that, the last stage here is going to be to clean up or remove the columns that we don't want to show our users. So for these user added and users removed fields, we're going to just go ahead and uncheck show for those, and the same for the communities added and the communities removed table here. And then we can also make it so that our users inline view is also has the correct display name, so we can change this to just users, so we're not showing users inline, and then do the same for the communities as well. We'll hit save and see how that looks. One last consideration for these records is to remove. We have essentially two fields that we're using essentially here. One is this view that allows us to set the community values. And then we have the other view, which is going to be to just view and interact with. So in this case, we don't confuse the user in our app. We'll also want to make sure we go to the view here and make sure we only show the column that's relevant for that view, i.e. if it's a form view, we're going to show the primary column that's used to record that so that users can interact with that form view. And then if it's just a detail view, then we could show them this inline column instead. We could come down here to the community detail, and under column order, just simply make sure we select the columns that we want to show for the detail view, which will be the community description and the inline users. And we'll also add the image here to the detail view as well. And then for the form, we will add in the community description, image, and users in the form itself. And then the same goes for the user fields as well. So we have the communities inline for the detail view, and then for the form view, we will have the name, profile, and then the communities. Okay, so we'll go ahead and hit save. And now our final result is we now have an app that is relatively straightforward for users to understand and is actually very flexible with this many-to-many relationship. So, once again, using Amber as an example here, when we click on Amber, we can come in, easily update and add communities. When we hit save, we see these communities down below that we can interact with. And when we view these communities, we now also have inline view that we can also interact with and update users and add them to the app, but also show an inline view of records that are associated with that for users to have actions to interact with or click on them to actually pull up those records respectively. So with that, thanks everybody for watching. Appreciate you. If you made it all the way through this video, then good on you. I know it was long and relatively probably tedious compared to my usual videos, but hopefully this helps you understand how to set up a many-to-many relationship within AppSheet. What I did here was more complex than probably what you would need to do. I did this to show you all the different methods in one on how you can actually create these relationships between tables if you need something more complex than just a one-to-many relationship. So in this video, we covered basically how you can set up the different columns here to keep track of the different entities that your main table and a record would be associated with, columns to keep track of what was added or removed for that table, and then in the app, the formulas that we would put in place here for the auto compute with an initial value that is resetting on edit every time we're calculating the entities that were removed or added to that record. And this information is then being used by the actions in my app here to then record and basically trigger the other table to update the values through an automation bot. So whenever the change is made in one table, we actually have a bot for each table that will then go and update the other table with those changes respectively. So we have two tables that stay in sync with each other, and both tables have the information that they need. Now, as I mentioned, you may not have to do both ways in some situations. So I would just consider looking at your use case specifically and looking at what your users are going to need to do to determine on what level of detail do you need to go into setting up this many-to-many relationship. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And once again, appreciate you watching and have a good one.